Okay, so good evening and good evening, especially to our guests who have taken the time to listen to the topics on our business ethics class for this evening. So I'm the first speaker for this evening, and I'll be talking about establishing psychological safety and reducing noise in the exercise of leadership. Now, for this particular presentation, I'll be getting and consolidating some of the concepts and key ideas from these particular references or textbooks, primarily for organizational safety or psychological safety. I will lift handsomely from Amy Edmondson's work, 2019, The Fearless Organization. And for reducing noise, I will, fresh off the press, from the 2021 book of Kahneman, Sibony, and Sunstein, entitled Noise, a
Okay,
Flaw in Human Judgment.
Chipi, excuse me.
Yep.
Because I think the fan might be hitting your microphone because it's a bit there's a some
Meron ba?
yeah.
Okay.
I think now it's okay.
Okay, sige.
Okay, thank you.
And then for the secondary sources, which I use to help tie all the elements together, I've made liberal use primarily from Daniel Goleman, Richard Boyatzis, and Annie McKee on primal leadership, 2002 book. The earlier work by Daniel Kahneman, okay, Thinking Fast and Slow, which was published back in 2011. And lastly, on the idea of judgment and leadership by Noel Tichy and Warren Bennis. So if you guys are interested in knowing more on what I'm going to explain this evening, well, these are the references that you can use. Now, to start off, the idea of leadership can be viewed in this particular upward cascade, if you may, right? So leaders, their capabilities, their talents, and how they exercise and utilize those capabilities and talents form their leadership styles. Okay? And the exercise of leadership styles actually affect organizational climate or the environment where the people, okay, under the leader would be in. Okay? And if things are doing pretty well, as hoped for, because of that very positive organizational climate, the next result would be you'd have employees who would be engaged and enabled. And lastly, because they're engaged and enabled, they will actually lead to results. Now, based on researches from 20, 30 years ago, they found out that 50 to 70% of all the explanatory factors or variables that affected organizational climate can be tied to the leadership styles, okay, or the leadership ways or means on how the leader actually exercised his or her skills. Okay? And around 30% of the end result, particularly if you're looking at financial results, okay, or the execution of those results, can be traced to the organizational climate, okay, and how employees have become engaged and enabled as a result or as an effect. And we can see that uh, when things are working well, if the machine, so to speak, is functioning as expected, you'd expect higher employee satisfaction, lower turnover or attrition of employees, higher customer satisfaction. So the clients and the customers of your organization would actually be satisfied as well, okay? And which would in turn have or lead to increased profitability. So, in effect, when we're looking at leadership, okay, I'd like to prime prime the audience that I personally view leadership as something systemic or systematic, as you say. If you do a quick spot check on is there any standard literature on systemic leadership or systematic leadership, there's no general consensus in terms of what this really means. You will probably see a few references that talk about systemic leadership or systematic leadership. But what's common about all of these ideas is that uh, this type of leadership means that the leader is very much aware that he or she is part of a system, and whatever he or she does within that system, okay, is an expression of his or her leadership. Okay. This slightly moves away from the idea that leadership is very much limited to what the leader does directly to the followers or to the members of the team. Okay. You can also look at systemic leadership or systematic leadership as something that affects the environment. Okay, and we're not talking of environment like Greenpeace environment or things about the trees and the rivers and the oceans, but environment it pertains to the surroundings, pertains to the general atmosphere or climate of a particular organization. And with that, if we go back to that earlier cascade, we are really focusing on this little piece in the middle of it all, which is organizational climate. Okay? And the first part of tonight's presentation would be trying to establish psychological safety. Okay? And psychological safety is very much related or connected to organizational climate. Okay? So the first half of this presentation will be talking about how to establish psychological safety and why psychological safety is important in the exercise of one's leadership. Now, secondly, you'd notice that a big chunk or perhaps a significant portion of the downstream results that you'd be getting, if you'd like to get really, really good results, then you'd know that a lot of the factors would come from or would hinge on organizational climate. And therefore, it becomes very imperative that we have a good handle, a good level of predictability of how we actually operate and manage that particular organizational environment. And the second half of our presentation will be talking about reducing noise. So we'll talk about these two in that particular order. So now, uh, let's talk about the first part, which is establishing psychological safety. Now, maybe just a quick spot check on everyone for those in the call right now. If you'd like to type something on the chat box, when you hear of psychological safety, what would be the first thing that comes to your mind? So I'll pause for a while and I'll let you guys chime in. So if you can see the chat window in Google Meet, you can type, okay, what are the few things, first things that come to your mind when we talk about psychological safety? Okay, mental health, peace of mind, okay. Anything else? Okay, feeling of security and safety to provide feedback, okay. Other thoughts from the audience? Maybe a few more seconds. Still. Okay, well, in a way, you guys sort of uh, touched on the correct idea, if you think about it. And well, there are many definitions about psychological safety, and we'll use the train of thought of what Amy Edmondson talks about when she discusses psychological safety. And primarily, it's about learning safely in the workplace, simply put, right? Um, and the first emphasis that we'd like to put out here is learning. In any organization, there is this default tendency to think of performance or delivering results or output. Okay? That's par for the course. Everyone is expected to deliver. But what makes a very good organization very, very good compared to a mediocre or a laggard organization can be from the fact that the very good organizations, uh, while they're performing really well, are also learning organizations. So the organization is able to learn, to get feedback, as was mentioned by one of you, and using that feedback to actually make adjustments, okay? Understanding what might have gone wrong, what worked well in the past, or for continuing ongoing purposes. Okay, and that's the goal of psychological safety primarily, so that the organization can actually be equipped to learn. Okay, and the real reason why it's able to learn is because the people involved in the organization are feeling safe that they can learn. And this is in contrast with the idea that uh, in an organization that tends to be very punitive, they tend to punish even the slightest mistakes, then there is this no room or window or margin to try things out and learn along the way. Because the objective of that type of organization is just to do things well, and it's going to be very difficult for the members of that organization to try anything new or really understand what went wrong, even in situations when things do go wrong, and yet they've gone wrong not for their not because of their fault, not another fault, not their fault. Okay? There's no way for the organization to properly understand what went wrong. Okay? So the idea of organizational, okay, of psychological safety rather, is that the people involved in the organization are sort of secure that there's not going to be a retaliation, an official retaliation from the organization. Okay? Amy Edmondson, just to share a bit on how this idea came about, it started with her study of hospitals. So she was reviewing what made some of the medical institutions really good and what made some of the medical institutions really bad. In a nutshell, she was trying to find out which hospitals were really good. And the first hypothesis she had was, okay, the hospital that made the fewest mistakes. Okay, that seemed logical. So she did an examination. Okay, there were hospitals that were doing fewer mistakes than others. But when she started to match the data, okay, revealing the hospitals that were performing really well, that were like highly reputable in terms of patients are comfortable or confident in these hospitals, they realized that the ones that had the most mistakes are the ones that are really performing at a peak level. So she started to ask herself, why is this so? I mean, it doesn't seem to look commonsensical or logical even. And she realized that it's not just about the number of mistakes that the organization does. Okay? What happens in a psychologically safe organization is that everybody feels comfortable reporting mistakes. So in those hospitals that have reported the highest number of mistakes, okay, they're the ones that actually feel more trust, that they feel more comfortable actually reporting these mistakes, as opposed to those hospitals that reported a fewer number of mistakes. Okay, the climate of that hospital was that they're not really comfortable reporting mistakes because there could be some negative consequences that might happen to them if they do report those mistakes. So overall, it's not just about the mistakes per se that really defines what makes an organization great, right? It's not about minimizing, making sure that nobody does a mistake, but it's about the organization wherein if people make mistakes, it's okay to learn from the mistakes and recover from the mistakes. And now, when we talk about establishing psychological safety, there are three general themes that leaders have to keep in mind in order to establish psychological safety. Well, first is setting the stage. Second is inviting participation from everybody in the organization to participate, to report mistakes, no, or helping one another. And lastly, the third aspect in establishing psychological safety is responding productively. So let's do a drill down on each one. On the first aspect of setting the stage, okay, first thing that a leader should be doing is to reframe the idea of failure. In a traditional sense, especially those who've been perhaps steeped in the culture of manufacturing, wherein the slightest failure would mean product defect, would mean additional cost to the organization. Uh, Now, leaders are encouraged to take a look at failure in a different light. Okay? And the thing here is that failure can actually be one of three types. Okay? It could be a preventable failure, which is generally what you'd see in routine activities in organizations that follow, for example, an assembly line where the procedure is fixed, it's predictable, it can be defined empirically. You can have failures, on the other hand, that are complex, okay? That it's so difficult for you to attribute the source of the failure. Okay? It could be a combination or a confluence of many factors. Okay? Or it could be an intelligent failure, wherein this failure is a result of an experiment, okay? A result of a trial or proof of concept. Okay? So the idea here is that you have to ask yourself, if you're the leader, you ask yourself, if I'm looking at this failure, is this failure a preventable failure? Or was this an intelligent failure? Or was this really a complex failure? And by knowing the type of failure, okay, it allows you as a leader to understand what might be the appropriate next steps in light of those failures. Okay? And even if we're dealing with preventable failures, okay, it's possible that the preventable failure was a first instance for a new hire, or it could have been a preventable failure from somebody that's not part of the organization, but everybody knows it's preventable. Okay? So that step back and looking at failure and trying to understand what that failure is the very first thing that you want to do when you want to build psychological safety. You reframe the idea of failure. Now, the second idea in setting the stage is reframing the roles. In a traditional organization, people are so dependent on leaders. Okay? And they're dependent on leaders to actually define what is successful or what is to be considered as a success and what is considered as something that's anathema or a heresy in the organization. Well, the point of view for reframing roles is that everybody needs to contribute. Okay? Everybody needs to understand that it's not always the leader who will be defining the criteria, okay? And that the leader is not a know-it-all. Okay? So it starts by making sure that everyone participates, okay, in the organization and participates in actually trying to learn with the organization, with the leader. Okay? And with that, when you reframe roles, you actually address a few things. Well, one is you want to be able to address uncertainty, especially in light of what happened with the pandemic last year. Okay, there was so much uncertainty all around. Okay, it would be very simplistic to depend too much on our leaders. Okay? And yet, in times of crisis, the leaders have to establish himself or herself, okay, as a beacon of stability for the organization. Okay? At the same time, if that leader is able to encourage everybody, okay, perhaps through an occasional revelation of vulnerability, okay, then he or she can actually invite people eventually to participate and contribute in facing this uncertainty together. Okay? Another thing that gets addressed when you reframe the roles of the organization is you're able to address the interdependence. In the traditional way of looking at the role of the leader and the role of the employees in the organization, it tends to be one way. Like the flow is always leader to employees, and that's it. But the reality of today's organization is that there are many arrows that can connect each and every member of the organization. And it's never just one way from the leader downwards. Okay? It can go upwards, it can go lateral, sideways. Okay? And it can go outside of the organization, okay? With your partners, with your vendors, okay? Even with your customers or clients. Okay? So if by understanding what these roles are, you're able to address the interdependence of the people within that organization. And lastly, when you try to reframe the roles, you are able to address what's at stake, what's really important, what's the mission of the organization. Okay? How do we all rally behind the vision, the mission of the organization? So that's part of reframing the roles. Okay? Uh, in order for you to be able to establish psychological safety. In a nutshell, okay, this particular idea of role reframing means that the leader should, in a way, start devolving a lot of the responsibility and even the accountability to everybody else in making sure that the learning process of the organization is not only limited or under the exclusive ambit of the leader. Uh, and another thing that needs to be reframed when you set the stage for psychological safety is reframing that sense of purpose, okay, or what's important in the organization. Naturally, organizations, especially companies that are supposed to be for profit, well, profit is an important purpose of the organization. But nowadays, we understand and appreciate that uh, it's not just about making money, it's not just about profits. Yes, it's still included. And more so, above that, there are other things that needs to be included. Now we go to the second aspect of establishing psychological safety, and this talks about inviting participation. Again, as leaders, we've started to establish it slowly, or just a while ago, that it's not only the leaders who are supposed to be setting the tone or setting the organization in a learning path. Okay? Everybody has to be involved in that learning aspect. Okay? And the first item in inviting participation is that expression, situational humility. Knowing that certain things might be new to us, certain things, certain cases would be something that we have no idea on how to handle immediately, probably the first time we're seeing it. And we've seen that as well with the pandemic last year. It was new. Nobody had experience dealing with a pandemic. Okay? And we've seen successful countries, okay, even successful organizations manage through the crisis by understanding that they know that they don't know this. Okay? And then they've gone through it holding that idea that I don't know everything. Okay? And because the leader doesn't know everything, then this allows the opportunity for everybody in the organization to come in and contribute and chime in. Okay? And part of organizational, or sorry, situational humility is the fact that we acknowledge that there are gaps in our knowledge. There are things that we don't know. As a leader individually, and even individually, each employee, we all have to acknowledge that there are gaps. So once we acknowledge that there are gaps, okay, individually, then we try to understand, okay, I have this gap of knowledge, but is there somebody else in the organization who can fill in that gap? Okay? And if you can identify someone in that organization who can fill in that gap, then that's a start of really drawing people to participate and coming up with a collective effort to address a situation. Okay? And similarly, for everybody else with their own respective gaps, okay, then you get to invite the other people within that organization who can eventually fill in those gaps. Okay? So that's part of situational humility. Okay? Now, the second aspect or task in inviting participation is proactive inquiry. Proactive inquiry is something that we're familiar with in the mentoring literature and the coaching literature, wherein when we're dealing with a mentee or with a client in a coaching engagement, we rarely give them directive statements. Okay? Successful coaching engagements are always engagements of questions. The coach, the mentor, would be very skilled in asking questions. Okay? Why? Because the idea of asking questions is that the mentor or the coach is not the one who's going to be responsible for the changes that the client or the mentee needs to do, right? But the questions serve as some sort of a catalyst to tickle the minds and the wills of the mentee or the clients to really see whether it can be done something, or whether the client or the coachee can actually do something about it eventually. It all starts with knowing how to ask the right questions. And that's really a key skill that every leader should know what to do. In order to invite participation, rather than being directive with the people, or worse, rather than being critical, directly critical about what others are doing, okay, you have that genuine curiosity. You're trying to ask, why was this like this? Okay? Why was it like that? Okay? And that would help generate newer ideas. And sometimes the answers brought about by this, maybe it's a mechanical way of asking things at the start, but you will actually get more inputs when you start to hear certain answers popping up. Okay? So one way to actually invite people to come in is having that genuine curiosity, okay, of people, of what's really happening, okay, in order to draw out the right answers to the legitimate questions that the organization might have. Okay. And lastly, in order for us to be able to invite more people to participate, is creating a structure for input, designing structures for input such that it would be easier for employees to actually give feedback. Okay? Naturally, if there are no channels available for employees to share their ideas, okay, or share their concerns, okay, then it would be very difficult to ensure participation and inclusion from the employees. We're often reminded of the old school way of trying to invite participation, and it's that iconic suggestion box that normally is mounted on the wall, very prominently displayed in a highly visible area, perhaps in the pantry or in the lounge of every company. Okay, of course, we've seen jokes wherein sometimes you see the suggestion box inside the closet room, right? I mean, in the broom closet. I mean, nobody's going to think of finding a suggestion box inside a storage room, right? But yeah, I mean the mechanism there, the idea of having something as structured as a suggestion box, or maybe now in our modern implementation, we probably get surveys or feedback from people, or even just this mailbox wherein people can just ask questions, okay, and they can send anonymized feedback, okay, or suggestions or comments, okay, to the organization. Well, these are examples of structures, okay, and it's important that leaders should be able to provide these structures that are easily accessible by everyone, so that they can actually give in their thoughts. Okay, and more than the structures, eventually, along with everything else that's been mentioned prior to this point, is having that process to be able to have these employees consistently give inputs, okay, for the leader to understand. Okay. Now, the reason why you want to put these structures in place is because we're concerned about voice. We're concerned that uh, everyone is given an opportunity, a chance to voice their concerns. There's this dictum, when leaders go higher up the ladder, they tend to hear less and less from the organization, right? So it's important that for leaders, especially those who are really leading entire organizations, that there is a mechanism for people to voice out their concerns, that people have a voice, people have a say in whatever it is that is happening or whatever it is that's going to happen. And that's one way for the organization to actually establish participation and even inclusion from the organization. Now, the third aspect is how do we respond productively? Now we've set the tone, we've set the stage for everyone, we've somehow conditioned the appropriate mindset for psychological safety. We've created ways and means to allow and invite people to participate in the organization. What should be the response, the appropriate response of the leaders now at this stage? What should the leaders do by now? Okay. Well, the very first thing is to express appreciation. It's very basic. Sometimes we forget about it. Most leaders or bosses would think, well, you're paid for this anyway. That's an expectation. But I mean, as human beings as well, and it has been shown in proper research that when people are appreciated, when they're recognized, whether in private or publicly, they feel more motivated and they feel more incentivized to help the organization more. Okay? And this appreciation need not be complicated. It doesn't have to cost much as well. Okay? But the important thing is appreciation is expressed, appreciation is given to employees. Okay? And this is the first step in responding to every contribution that's being bubbled up to the leaders. Okay? Now, another thing that leaders can do to respond productively is destigmatizing failure. Okay? We just said a while ago that the traditional way, perhaps, of looking at failure is through the lens of a manufacturing organization, wherein the smallest errors can lead to product defects, which would lead to products that could not be sold anymore in the market. Well, the idea here is that, well, we destigmatize failure. We allow the possibility that failure can happen. And in fact, we realize that failure is sometimes a natural byproduct of experimentation. Uh, and you should expect to fail if you're trying things out. For example, if an organization is trying to enter a new market, okay, even though they may not be the first ones to actually go into that market, maybe their competitors have gone before them. Well, as an organization, they haven't done it themselves. So they will necessarily have to experiment. And they will fail. Okay? And it's important that the leaders in such case would, they should not ostracize the people in charge of leading the organization in that to that new market. Okay? It's so failure is natural. It is to be expected. And at the same time, uh, leaders, okay, and everybody else in the organization understand that you have to produce. Okay? You have to learn from failures and share the lessons from intelligent failures. So that is the expectation. In fact, some of the best leaders actually promote the idea that you fail right away, about failing fast, especially in high velocity industries or like the technology industry. It's important that you fail fast. Why? Because you are able to learn fast. You're able to learn these things as quickly as possible. So failure should not be something to be avoided completely. Okay, and that's the idea here. Okay, this culture, this custom that okay, it's okay to fail. Okay, for as long as okay we know the risks involved. We know that failure can happen, and if it does happen, that we learn from failure. Okay, and we share the lessons from that failure. Okay? We don't keep it to ourselves. We find ways to codify that failure, which is why in a learning organization, it is important that their knowledge management systems are also robust. Okay? That whatever lessons that each one would have learned, that they immediately funnel it through the knowledge management system of the organization. And when we're destigmatizing failure, we actually promote fast learning, okay, which is good, especially in an environment such as right now with the pandemic, okay, wherein things can be very volatile, can be uncertain. It's important that we learn fast. Okay? We can make mistakes, probably not even mistakes. Maybe things weren't really within expectations. Okay? Maybe it might have been suboptimal, but regardless, we learn fast. We try to understand what didn't really go as expected and make the adjustments along the way. Okay? And the final step, well, of course, I mean, we're not trying to promote failure in the sense that, okay, it's 100% okay that people make mistakes. Okay. No, that's not the point here. Of course, there are cases wherein it is very, very clear that a mistake is a heinous, grievous mistake. Okay. And in which case, you still need to have that lever as a leader to sanction clear violations. Okay. If there are things that are obviously not part of, let's say, if it's enshrined in your policy explicitly, don't do X, okay, and somebody does X, then it's important to implement that policy right away, okay. So when things are examples of clear violations, then sanctions have to be brought up. Okay? And but the idea here is not just being punitive, as I was saying earlier. Okay, it's about addressing preventable failures. Okay? And I think that's the point here. I mean, you don't want to sanction right away failures that are intelligent failures. Obviously, you don't want to sanction failures that are complex, wherein the accountability can be muddled along the way. But when you look at this type of failure, and even the subset of preventable failures, okay, these are the uh, types of failures wherein, okay, I mean, you have to sanction, you have to punish, okay, and it has to be clear. Of course, it's important that we be clear about what is punishable, what is not acceptable to the organization, and so that people have a clear guideline, clear idea of what is really taboo or what is really part of the blacklist of the organization. So these are the three aspects on how one can establish psychological safety. Now we move on to the other aspect, which is reducing noise. Okay? So maybe just for quick pulse from everyone. Okay, when you think of noise, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? So let's pause for a while. Pause for a few seconds for the crowd to, for the audience right now to type in the chat box. What do you think is noise? When you hear of the word noise, what does it mean? What does that mean to you? Let's wait for the others to type. So what is noise? If you have noise, what is noise? Okay, pollution. Okay, yeah, noise pollution. Correct. Exterior and interior disturbances. Okay. Okay. Any other? We'll wait for a few seconds for you guys to type in. Okay. Maybe a couple more before I proceed. Sound. Okay. Noise. Yeah. Sound. Okay. Disturbance. Irritable. Okay. Okay. Now, all of these things that you've mentioned in the chat box, okay, they're related to noise. Okay. Now, for our specific purpose on what noise is, okay, let's start off with the idea of what error is. Okay. And coming from the previous portion of our presentation, okay, when we're talking about failures, we're talking about psychological safety. Well, it's related to error. Okay, and it's part of the human condition. We are prone to errors. Now, the error is actually potentially coming from bias. Okay, it is something that can be addressable. Okay, it's something that can be addressed. Okay, it's something that when we talk about bias, it's like perhaps you're oriented towards one way, but you should have been oriented like 15 degrees to the right, 15 degrees to the left. I mean, your situation is a biased view of things. Okay, now, because it's biased, then you don't really hit the true value. Okay? So that's bias, which is a big factor for error. But so is noise. And noise can be anything and everything that happens around. It's a disturbance, it's a fluctuation. It's something that you can't even control. It's something that you don't even know, right? Uh, and the thing here is that when we're discussing noise, we're discussing bias, You can think of this as a simple equation, wherein error is actually a function of both bias and noise. The thing here is that we have a lot of literature that talks about biases, cognitive biases, and the different types of biases, like the availability bias or anchoring. We talk about other biases like the recency biases, or even things related to the halo effect or the horn effect. Okay, these are examples of biases. Wherein, okay, because we have gotten something from somewhere, now the entire internal system that we have is oriented in a skewed manner. Okay? But we also forget that noise also contributes to the picture. Okay? And what's a good example of noise in the workplace? Well, noise is something similar to that famous study of judges. So when they studied judges, okay, when they're making decisions of certain cases of a particular class. For example, they want to find out parking tickets, like how do they define the judgment for parking violations. Okay. They would notice the judges tend to be more lenient after lunch compared to before lunch. Okay. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that the lunch has anything to do with whether a person should be punished more or less? Well, no, obviously not, right? I mean, it's not dependent on whether the judge had lunch or not. And yet, if we take a look at the output, okay, the reality there is that, okay, based on facts, okay, the judges are more lenient after they've taken lunch compared to before lunch. And of course, and that's noise. There was nothing that the judge would have done, uh, perhaps prior to the knowledge that they're affected by it. Okay, and sometimes they won't look at it on a singular case. It's only when you take a look at the aggregate of all of these cases that you get to realize, oh, there's a pattern of noise here. Okay? And that also leads to error. So not only are we supposed to be concerned with just bias, okay, preparing ourselves to be not biased, okay, or not discriminatory in our mindset, but also being sensitive to the fact that we are susceptible to noise. Okay. And for this portion, we will talk a little bit about decision hygiene. Okay? How do we do decision making so that we're able to avoid bias? Okay, that's part of it, but also, okay, more importantly, avoiding noise. Okay? There are many ways on how we can actually exercise decision hygiene. Now, it's a good description because now in the pandemic, we are advised to do hand washing. Okay. Now, of course, when we wash our hands, it's not clear to us that we're actually killing the coronavirus as we're washing our hands. We don't have that certainty. But we know for a fact that if we wash our hands, then the probability that the virus, including the coronavirus, will be killed would be very high. So that's the idea of hygiene. Okay, it's not it's not a direct intervention to address the problem, but knowing that if we do these things constantly, if we do these things in a broad spectrum manner, we will hit and actually address and correct the problems brought about by noise and at the same time by bias as well. Okay? And the reason why this is important and why decision hygiene is important for organizations and for leaders is knowing that judgment is a process. Okay? And taking from that idea that sometimes when we assess things, we get this feeling of doing snap judgments, right? But we fail to appreciate that judgment always is a process and therefore needs to be deliberate and therefore would always be susceptible to errors, okay, to biases, to noise, which is why, okay, for us, for leaders, okay, since judgment is an important part of the toolbox of a leader, that he or she must know how to make sure that the judgment process is clean, in a way, okay, quote unquote, okay, because we view judgment as a process. Okay. Even if you made a wrong judgment, a bad judgment, because it's a process, there is a mechanism to correct that judgment. It's a part of the process. So, in decision hygiene, the first thing that we have to understand is that the goal of judgment is accuracy, not individual expression. Now, you might argue, well, what about brainstorming activities? People are supposed to express themselves individually. Is brainstorming a bad activity? Is it wrong? Well, no, because understand that the goal in brainstorming is to make sure that you have a wide range of inputs from people. Now, if you're able to get a wide range of people, okay, the wider the range, the more broad the range of inputs are, then the more accurate your brainstorming is, and so you're able to fulfill the goal of accuracy. Uh, the idea is you want to make sure that things are accurate. Okay, so that's important. You want to hit to the true value as much as possible in every single case of judgment. Okay. Now, the second idea, okay, the second recommendation is that leaders should think statistically. Okay, it doesn't mean that you have to be a statistician, right? But the common idea on how people can think statistically is by understanding that you always have to take an outside view of the case, especially if you're somebody quite invested in that particular case and you have to make a judgment or an assessment of that particular case. The best way for you to avoid noise or error in general is taking an outside view. And it's just as simple as asking yourself and everybody involved, if somebody else would take a look at this same case, what would they say? Or what would they think? Or what would be their assessment? And, and that's one way to think statistically. In fact, by taking an outside view as an outsider, because you're not an insider, the first thing that you want to ask is, okay, so what's the probability of this happening in general? Or what's the probability of this happening for similar cases outside of this organization? That's taking an outside view. And sometimes in projects, we fail to take the outside view because we seem to be invested in ourselves. Okay? And this is known as a planning fallacy, right? When we make estimates of certain projects, we tend to underestimate the effort required because once we start running those projects and seeing what really happens afterwards, we realize that our earlier estimates were lacking. Right? But it could have been avoided somehow if we asked ourselves, if this project, okay, was done by somebody else, what would this somebody else think? Are the estimates correct? Okay? And if we're going to take a look at other projects similar to this projects, how do they perform? So that's taking an outside view. Okay? And the thing with an outside view, okay, we'll use another term, humility again, is that idea of predictive humility. Knowing that, okay, we temper our exuberance, we temper our optimism, okay, that things will really go well by understanding that, if we take a look at other cases similar to ours, what was their experience? What was their situation? And that's being predictively humble, okay, as this point drives out. Now, another thing to look into is what is known as a structure and split. So when making assessments, the idea is to structure the assessment and then splitting them according to individual aspects or criteria and working on each one independently. And one method that expresses the structure and split method is the idea of mediating assessments protocols. All this says is that if you are to judge something, okay, and this something needs to be judged according to, let's say, 5 criteria, well, you take a look at each criterion one at a time before gathering all 5 together and making your judgment. Okay? So that's what mediating assessments protocol is about. Okay, it's tempering that idea of looking at things holistically right away. Okay, but instead going to the individual items first. Okay, completing the assessment per item before going to the next item. So that's the whole idea there. It's a structure and split. Naturally, you can't go to each item if you don't know what those each items are, right? So that's the importance of structure. Okay, so it avoids that gut feel way of assessing things, right? And it's important that you are also explicit about what's really evaluated. Okay? And sometimes this is very useful, very helpful in processes like recruitment, in staffing and performance management. That when we, as leaders, when you evaluate the performance of an employee for the past year, you don't try to look at it in one look right away. Now, you look at the individual criteria first, individual criterion, discuss each criterion solidly, comprehensively, before moving to the next criterion. And then, only then, towards the end, you sum it all up. Okay? And then you will see that the results are more accurate. Okay? Now, another idea here, which is what we've mentioned just a while ago, is resisting that premature intuition, right? That gut feel. And sometimes we see this when we're dealing with people, right? If we're susceptible to the similarity bias or to the halo or horn effect, as I said a while ago, it's resisting those premature intuitions. Intuitions are not useless; they're important. But the advice is that you want the intuitions to be at the end, which is why, in this case, it's important to sequence the information. You don't try to gather everything in one go, okay, and make the assessment in one go. No, you take up the information slowly but surely, combining it with the mediating assessments protocol, okay, and then only then can you use your intuition towards the end. So that's the advice. The idea is don't use your intuition at the start, use it at the end when you've actually structured, split, sequenced the information correctly. And part of this is the other tip is that judgments have to be done independently, especially if you're dealing with multiple people, okay, doing judgments of the same thing. Making sure that everyone does their judgments independently first, and only then you aggregate everything at the end. Which is why deliberation methods done at the start tend to yield poor performances when it comes to judgment making or, 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 or decision making. Okay? Because it's possible, and we've seen this in literature, groups can be susceptible to groupthink, for example. People are unable to think on their own. Whereas, if people start to assess these things individually first and then aggregating them at the end, okay, you will actually get a sharper, more accurate assessment of the situation. So the idea is to do the judgments independently first and then aggregating them towards the end. Okay. And lastly, when the last aspect of decision hygiene is making use of relative judgments or relative scales. And when we talk about relative judgments, okay, in the absence of clear criteria or clear benchmark, okay, then we compare with a relative class, as they say, or we compare with a base rate, as they say, or if we don't even have that information, comparing it with a case scale. So the idea here is that we don't compare with ourselves. So it's important then when you make judgments, it's important that there are guidelines, there are benchmarks, that are precedents where people can compare. Okay. And the thing here is that these comparisons, they're not fixed over time. They can change. Okay? They can be adjusted over time. Okay? But what's important is that they are actually able to deal more. Okay, there's more accurate output or in terms of assessment if the judgment is done in a relative manner, as opposed to doing the judgment individually on your own, okay, wherein if you have no guidelines, okay, chances are you will be susceptible to well prevailing biases or anchoring, as the case might be. Okay. Now, all these things about decision hygiene, okay, they presume that they would happen to routine activities, things that we have to do so often, like in the case of doctors, okay, in the case of teachers, having to evaluate the essays of so many students. Now, the question there is what if you're about to decide things only once, in the case of a black swan event or an extremely rare occasion or event? How do you avoid noise? How do you reduce it? Well, for singular decisions, one mindset that leaders can adopt is that Singular decisions are nothing more than recurring decisions done only once. Okay, it's quite funny because okay, done only once. They're not really recurring decisions, right? For those of you who are mathematically inclined, you understand that the definition of the factorial is actually n and then n minus one and minus two, so on and so forth, right? But in the end, you still define the zero factorial. Okay? Well, the thing here is that whatever we're doing for recurring decisions as far as decision hygiene goes, that works also for singular decisions. And there shouldn't be any fear that there's going to be any error with the decision if we do decision hygiene. Similarly with hand washing, okay, if we're only going to visit the hospital once, nothing wrong in washing your hands, okay? As opposed to if you have to visit the hospital many times, okay? So naturally, you'll have to do your hand washing frequently as well. Okay? So, but nothing wrong in doing hand washing still, even if you're just going to the hospital once, right? Same idea with singular decisions. Now, to wrap everything up, okay, so we've discussed how organizational climate is at the heart of leadership nowadays. And the first thing that you want the leader to do is establishing psychological safety. And then lastly, because we know the connection of leadership, organizational climate, and results, and we want to be as accurate and as effective, as predictable as we want it to be, then the other thing that leaders should be concerned about is reducing noise, also in the exercise of leadership. And to sum it all up, okay, so when we talk about psychological safety, we've talked about the three aspects. Okay, we talked about setting the tone, inviting participation, okay, and responding appropriately. And when we're talking about reducing noise, okay, we're talking about decision hygiene. Okay, doing things, everything as much as possible to reduce potential sources of noise that can actually lead to various errors. Now, you can think of this type of leadership as a scientistic leadership. So it's a term that I'm coining right now. Is that the idea that as leaders, we're not prosecutors. We're not making that being so judgmental about other people. As leaders, we are not politicians, knowing how to dance and glide with a crowd. Okay? uh, we're also not priests, wherein we can be very preachy, and we say that we're so doctrinaire in our approach. But rather, as leaders, we have to be like scientists. We have to be curious. We need to have an hypothesis in mind and test the hypothesis. And if our hypothesis is wrong, we change our minds, change the hypothesis, test again. Okay, we accept that facts are important, that no matter what our gut feel would say, if the facts tell us otherwise, then we should follow the facts. So the idea of leadership is something as scientific, and this is what I leave you with this presentation. That the type of leadership that's really expected from us right now is that similar to the mindset of the scientist. And now I'd like to turn the floor over to you guys for any questions.
Okay, are there any questions from anyone?
Hey, Chipi, I have one.
Yeah,
If you
go,
don't
Ding
Okay,
Ding.
mind.
good.
So I learned something new from you today. Thanks, because of you, I've learned that psychological safety. With that is a belief that one can speak up without risk of punishment or humiliation. And I could relate somehow teaching in ABEP. Sometimes I get when I call someone and make cold calls to people, it could be nerve wracking pag recitation. So, similar to moderation. So, naalala ko yung Pareto optimal scheme na 80-20 with
Mhm.
your
Mm.
chart on the leadership style that leads to organizational culture. And now that we have a lot of work from home, mga hybrid means, it makes psychological safety difficult. So, sabi nga nila, it takes time to build, but it takes a moment to destroy. Once someone gets embarrassed, baka ano siya, scarred for life. And sometimes when I give oral exams. I get to enter to my students' home virtually. I see what their background, their pets, their family members. So I have to be more careful. Kunyari, comments or I serve like a police for some of their classmates. If they make comments like, I miss you na, that might mean na, you're not performing well kasi we don't see you much more. So, as leaders or managers, um, maybe you can give us some practical or actionable strategies for us to promote the culture of psychological safety because it extends beyond the work and it also extends to the home. Can you think?
Mhm. Well, I mean, if we are extending the idea of psychological safety outside of the workplace, well, the principles are still applicable, right? Let's say in the case of a family or in the case of other collectives, maybe in your own barangay, in your own village. Psychological safety is still important, and the principles are the same. And what's the principle? We go back to that idea of learning, right? If the objective or the general feeling, I mean, I forget the, I don't have a much accurate term, but the general feeling is that you want everybody to learn. You want everybody to make sure that, okay, we're still expected to perform and we also need to learn. Okay, as long as that mindset is there, then the people involved would know how to actually employ specific practices to improve psychological safety. For example, in the case of families, there would be cases wherein the parents would have to make sure that you're not judging the person or the child directly, but you're also, I mean, talking about highlighting what was wrong. Okay, the action involved. You're commenting the action rather than the person involved. Or in the case of a larger community, you'd be talking about, let's say, a decision on whether you want to set up a parking lot in near the public market or something to that effect. Okay, I mean, how do you encourage everyone to speak up? Okay, there might be potential noise or pollution, let's say from the construction. So how do you bring that up? Well, but again, the whole idea of psychological safety is that eagerness to learn, as long as there are ways to establish that people still learn, and not just you, but everybody, that you actually are creating a mechanism wherein, the bright ideas get bubbled up. Okay, then that's how you can actually promote psychological safety. Okay. Now, of course, in the workplace, I mean, the prerogatives are clear, right? And we've talked that just a while ago, where we want to make sure that people speak up. There are mechanisms for people to share their thoughts. Of course, back in the old days, also, we're also advised to have a principle of non-retaliation. So we shouldn't be retaliating, even if you know that they're wrong, right? I mean, you don't retaliate right away. And a lot of it is really with the leader, the leader's control. And I would say that if the leader is also unable to control himself or herself, then psychological safety may be compromised, okay, because of the asymmetric relationship between the leader and everybody else. The leader holds some power, right? So it's important that the leader, dictates the tempo. So if the leader is somewhat malabo or anything of that sort, then the psychological safety would also be malabo. So yeah, I don't know if I've been able to hit your questions or your concerns now, but yeah, that's how I would answer your question now.
All right, thanks,
Yeah.
JP.
I just like to build on what you said, Chipi, regarding the role of the leader, because I think that's fundamental into establishing psychological safety as enabling factor precisely to deliver or achieve outcomes in the workplace. Well, just this week I started reading a book of Ramani Durvasula. She's actually a famous psychologist. She focuses basically on the issue of character, and she mentions two basic things: difficult characters, very much present, ubiquitous in the workplace and other places. No? The fact that you can encounter a person who's toxic and narcissistic. No? So in her book, basically, she says that okay, this phenomenon of narcissistic and toxic personalities are they're actually it's everywhere. And but I don't know if it's something which can be said in the Philippine context because this author even says that okay, well, there's a place in the U.S. where perhaps okay we can say that okay it's the epicenter of narcissism and uh, and toxicity in terms of characters. And she mentions this actually this place L.A. No, Los Angeles no, as the as the center of well toxicity and well this thing of difficult characters. No? In the Philippine culture, for instance, in organizations, do you think it's prevalent phenomenon having toxic people because having toxic and narcissistic characters will definitely would undermine psychological safety.
Um, it's true. I mean, it's true that having all these characteristics of toxicity and all that, they do undermine psychological safety. One thing that was explained, at least by Amy Edmondson, and this was a very critical point early in the research, was it something dependent on culture? Okay, or is it just an American phenomenon or a Western phenomenon? Or is this something that is possible, let's say, in the Eastern context? And we sometimes see the dichotomy between Western organizations versus Eastern organizations, like the Chinese, the Koreans. Is it any different? Is psychological safety also useful or pertinent or applicable to the Eastern context? And the answer to that is yes. And the idea is that when we look at human beings, okay, the idea of learning is actually universal. People learn, whether you like it or not. People learn. How they learn, maybe the processes or the mechanisms vary. For example, in some cultures, the learning mechanism is not through a formal education system that we're used to, right? In the West, it can be through apprenticeship, and we see this in a lot of the so-called primitive cultures wherein they learn their trade, they learn their crafts by being an apprentice to somebody else, okay, to a master usually. And that's how learning happens. So for as long as there's learning, okay, um, there's that idea that okay, psychological safety can be established. It should be possible. There were other anecdotal, okay, they're not really empirical evidences, but even other cultures like African cultures, for example, or tribes, they are able to establish psychological safety through their own mechanisms. Like there's this, apparently there's this custom, it's quite disputed, wherein if somebody made a mistake in a tribe, somewhere in Africa, is that this person is being made to stand in the middle in front of the tribe, and then each one from the tribe starts sharing something to that person, one by one. What are they sharing? They're actually sharing the good things that this person has done, and that's quite peculiar because you would expect that this person would be scolded, okay, but apparently this tribe or how they're doing it is that they're encouraging that person to say, well, okay, you made a mistake, okay, own it up, okay, but you're also good. And I think the whole idea of psychological safety is a silent homage to the fact that people are capable of good. And as long as we're able to allow people to have these good things bubble up, then that should be good for everyone in the long run. So yeah, I would say from a cultural standpoint, even in the case of the Philippines, yeah, it should be possible, and given that we're culturally proximate also to the U.S., I mean, it shouldn't be that of a difficult process.
Yeah, and as you said, basically, it's not just basically the role of the leaders to provide that environment, but also a support group, meaning the team. Given our social orientation as well, we're more focused on groups rather than individuals. Okay, any other thing? Any other questions from the rest before we move on?